So earlier this year, there were some. Um, Actually, let's take it back. So from this war, we know that with the Ukraine war, there's energy prices going up in all of it throughout Europe, but it didn't really hit the French because their government decided to subsidize those costs and just kind of uh, try and keep the price normal for people. And I think that probably would have contributed to like there's a mentality from the French that like money just comes out of nowhere. The government can just pay for anything. It's not going to affect any budgeting or anything like that. But then what we saw earlier this year was, I suppose, in the course of redoing their budgets, they had this change of the retirement age, and so that was the last time that we saw big riots in France, where Macron wanted to change retirement age and maybe push it back like 2 or 3 years. And so there's a large number of people in France who are working for public sector, and I saw this with my wife's mom, who was expecting to retire like next year. Then she's pissed off that she's going to have to retire, like 2.5 years later or something like that. And so the weird dynamic in France is that the young people they so you'll have a protest and tons of people packing the street, and it'll be pretty orderly and whatnot like throughout the day. And then like the night comes, and you have young people kind of start to slowly amp it up and like add an energy to it that you don't see if it's like midday, because you'll see people uh, pretty much like insanely regularly. They're always protesting. It's not a joke. They're like, your train gets delayed because at the train station they decided to go on strike, or you know hear it, like there's always something going on. But then when you really hear about it is when uh, young people just start to pick it up like they did this time, and they also did after the retirement protests. So one of the weirdest things about France is like we can't necessarily put our like the U.S. perspective on race on it necessarily. Like Mr. Lambo was touching on it, where it's actually kind of a complex thing where they've got the 40, 50 years ago, or I suppose earlier than that, like after the Algerian independence, like taking back a bunch of people that were fighting for them over there, as well as like bringing on people in order to work, putting them in those sort of the seat, they call them a cité, like they're not suburbs like we think of them, but they're kind of basically like housing blocks or something, or like the projects or something all around cities. But then in addition to that, we've got like in the last 15 years, like almost a second wave of migration, which is the general migrant crisis. And that's where you saw people who were showed up for the first time, and they're just packed on the streets under like, if you took like Stalingrad metro station, just you imagine a city block, there's 1,000 young men just sitting there on the concrete each night. Um, I think one now that ties into what Mehdi was saying about like integrating people. So not only were they not able to integrate that first wave from like 60 years back or so, where I believe if we look back to the Bataclan attacks in 2015, like some of those people were like homegrown. They weren't like extremists that came from another place and then like snuck into France and then committed the acts, but they were people who actually like grew up and were French citizens, but they felt kind of like disconnected. And so you even have a phenomenon that happens now where if you go in Paris, it's like Paris is France, but if you go into the areas around Paris, a lot of times it changes pretty quickly. You'll go into areas that are very like basically just a different culture, very like maybe like a very Muslim, I suppose you could say, North African Muslim influence. And in those places, there are literally like feminist groups who have to you have a setup where with any expensive city, people are going to be pushed to live further and further out as the prices go up. So you have college kids and just kind of people in their 20s living out in some of these communities as well. And so I've seen where like some of my wife's friends living in those places, and they have to like join feminist communities to like advocate for women to be able to enter the bars, because the the people in there will literally say, yes, on fait comme ça à Paris, mais on n'est pas à Paris. Like we do like that in Paris, but this isn't Paris. They kind of see this as like those banlieue, or those like a kind of a suburb kind of project areas as like this is separate, where a different culture is infused. I think that that's the dynamic where you you basically have like two societies basically living right next to each other. You can see it anytime, like even in minor things, like if there's a soccer game and like Algeria wins, it's like they'll celebrate like no other. It's like, and not to say there's anything, but that's particularly negative, but it's like places where people have a strong identification with being not necessarily French, but like just next to French culture, even though they've this is the only place that they've known. They're maybe like 20 years old and their family's been there for like 50 years or something. So those are kind of I don't want to like keep rambling on, but that's just kind of to make it a little bit more specific to the themes that we're talking about. There are
Sounds like an immigrant problem
I
to
want to
me.
point.
yeah.
Yeah. So
Well,
here's the thing, though. Here's the thing. The riots in France, or what's happening now, is not that unique. It's because if you look at all of the Western European countries, particularly France, Belgium, the Netherlands, the UK, the riots get triggered by a particular event, and then they get blown up by predominantly young immigrants. And if you look at the background of these young immigrants, well, they tend to be out of jobs. They tend to be in criminal circuits. They tend to be easy targets to manipulate and or force them into a direction society doesn't want to be in it. Because now France is having this riot. In 2011 or 12, it was the UK who had a similar riot. 2020, the Dutch had a similar riot. Belgium, a few years back, had also very similar phenomena. And it seems to be a very particular group of immigrants, and then predominantly the ones who are young, so within the age of 17 to 25. And it is usually the same. So in France, it's the Algerians. In the Netherlands, it's and Belgium as well. It's mainly the Moroccans. In the UK, there is a bit more diversity, but they are all in the same age category. They all have an immigrant background, even though they are born in the nation. They are kind of stuck in a gray zone as to where they identify with the country, but not with the culture or the people. So it's like a vicious cycle in predominantly West Europe. So what you see in France now, it hits the news quite big, but it's not that new. It's not a very special event or phenomenon. This has been going on for the last 20 years or so.
I would like to point something. First of all, it's very interesting what Trey was saying when he was creating a kind of phenomenon in certain countries of Europe, because I also find it a kind of European phenomenon in a way. It's like our European societies have been growing so consciously about the middle class, forgetting that this middle class doesn't exist eternally in time and space, but it has been aging. And we have forgot how to integrate young people because they have become a minority. Our societies are old. Our middle class guys that used to be 30s are now 50s. And this is also something quite true. And our society, in terms of visibility, is an old guy society. We look at television, we look at politicians. They don't have really a young vibe. Even the bit to pretend they are young. That's also quite true. We saw Macron on a party. Actually, for his age, he's a bit outside of a disco.
He's young compared to his wife.
Are you sure? His wife is even older. But she was dancing. She still has the energy. Okay. But what I meant is that we have a problem in Europe for integration of younger people. And we don't really understand that younger people and each generation always has been there. Especially when society changed so much, we have problems normally to integrate the new generations. Now, in the past, this has been easy. It was very complicated when I grew up. We had the feeling that our younger community was quite different from our parents. We fought for it. But the society was a bit more open to see that we had new emergencies, new wishes, new requirements. And now we see that this new society that came from 10, 20 years ago doesn't want to see difference, doesn't want to accomplish, to open that there are new problems. No, Macron says it's the families, it's the video games. It can be true that it's the video games.